Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 150. Yeah, that's right. We've cranked out 150 of these. I'm quite frankly shocked myself. So, but that means that we're well on our way to our next penultimate 200th episode, which I would recommend sticking around the next couple of years for that. So we're going to do something a little bit different today. Normally for a bonus episode, we would have on a special guest and there wouldn't necessarily be any book reading on that episode. But today we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction. So instead of doing a bonus, a completely, totally pure bonus episode format, we're going to combine a regular episode with a bonus episode and make a 150th episode, right? That's what we're going to do today. And I'm joined today by our guest, Zac Stucki, who is the CEO of Ignition Point Strategies. Now, I'm going to pull directly from the Ignition Point website. Zac is, of course, going to correct us all on this, but I'm going to pull from the text from the copy on the site and read you directly from that. And I quote, Zac is a growth strategist who specializes in helping B2C companies acquire and retain their ideal users through deep customer insights. As the co-founder of Ignition Point Strategies, he unearths the often overlooked functional, emotional, and social dimensions that shape user behavior, allowing them to develop the full customer experience around delivering true value. In addition to writing, Zac is also a speaker and a workshop facilitator. It's that last part, more so than the first pieces there, that are interesting to us today, because I'm a workshop facilitator and a leadership development professional, right? Been facilitating and been engaged in leadership development for about the last almost 20 years. And the insights that we can get from leadership development that come through non-traditional books are part of what we are exploring on this podcast and part of what we're going to explore today with Zac. Zac is a reader, a leader, and a lifelong learner. He and I connected on LinkedIn probably about 6 months ago at the end of 2024. And after circling around for a little while and having him ping me on email, we talked about our shared interest in the value of leadership and the need for leaders to be informed by more insights than those that yet another business book could bring. Kind of goes along with the theme of this show. We settled on the book we were reading today, the text we are looking at today, because of Zac's interaction with the culture that influences the content. And culture always influences content. Zac brings a unique insight into the book we are going to talk about today, a book we covered previously on episode number 22 in the first season of the show, which I thought I did not do as well a job at as I probably could have. And so we're going to recover this book, and we're going to cover it a little more in depth. The book we're going to be looking at for our 150th episode today is The Art of War by Sun-Tzu. Now, the translation that I have, you can see this on the video, or you can listen to it on the audio and look at it in the show notes below the player, is the version that is translated by Thomas Cleary. Zac copy, which you can see right there on the video, is translated by Ralph D. Sawyer. And Zac brings a certain level of understanding to this as a Mandarin speaker. So this is going to be very, very interesting. And a person who had a and maybe we'll talk about this on the show as well today. An engaging missionary journey throughout Taiwan. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Taiwan. Yep. And so we're going to talk about that today. So leaders, I usually give you a little tip here at the beginning in the intro. Leaders, prepare for the next great moment, which is right on the horizon. Welcome to the show, Zac. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jesan. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I'm really excited to cover this material because there is so much here. We were talking, before we started recording this. There is so much here that is applicable even today when you boil it down to first principles or what a mentor of mine called lowest common denominators. And that just apply that we often miss because we in our arrogance think, oh, this is the first world. We have the internet, we have generative AI now, and we don't need those lessons. Oh, believe me, you do. As a leader, you need these lessons.
Well, we sometimes make very egregious, and we don't really think about it too much, but we egregious. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. Category errors, right? We confuse one thing for another, or we merge two things together in our heads, and then we speak to other people, and we expect that they've done the same merging, and they haven't. And so
Mm.
our analysis and our criticality is all off. And now we're in a space where there's a lack of understanding between two people. And sometimes this can happen this can happen in families, this can happen in organizations, this can happen in institutions. It's most egregious, of course, when it happens in families. But I would say the second level where it's pretty egregious is in the workplace, particularly between leaders and followers. And so category errors, overcomplicating things, not understanding the lowest common denominator. These are all factors that come in to our book today. And this book has been around for a while. We could talk a little bit about the history of it. We could talk a little bit about the background of it today as well. But before I jump into all that, so why don't you tell the listeners, tell everybody who's listening and watching our show today, what is it that you do exactly? I mean, I read from the Ignition Point Web Strategies website, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there's way more to it than that.
Yeah, if talking about first principles thinking, what I do is I help businesses understand why high intent sales prospects still walk away even after the sale, right? So it deals with improving customer retention, and it deals with helping businesses make sure that they capture more of those high intent sales prospects before they close as well.
When you say high intent sales prospects, break that down for me? What does that mean?
Yeah, so high intent sales prospects, typically we would define it as someone who has a problem that you solve. They know they have a problem that you solve, and they have a budget to solve it and a timeline in which they need to get it
Okay.
solved. And if they have those four things, we would consider them a high intent prospect, someone who's actively looking to solve that problem as soon as possible.
And so, in looking at the art of war, in looking at
Yeah.
sort of well, we've got to break this question down because now we're going to go off script. So let me break this question down a little bit. So in thinking about thinking about those high intent sales prospects, right? And you said they had four things in common. So they have a budget.
Yeah.
And then what were the other three?
So they have a problem that you
Right.
solve. They're aware of the problem. They have a budget and they have a timeline to solve that
Right. So
problem.
they have a budget, they have a problem, they have awareness, and they have a timeline, right? What do
Yeah.
you think in your reading of The Art of War? What do you think Sun Tzu would have to say about folks like that?
This is I love this question because this is something that I have been shouting from the rooftops. So when we talk about business strategy, and when we talk about business strategy, typically what we do is we take business strategy and we confuse it with military strategy. I mean, we're reading The Art of War for
Mm-hmm.
goodness sake, right? But when we do that, we're influenced by who we define as our competition. Now, in military strategy, your competition is someone who's competing over the same turf that you're competing for, same resources. In business strategy, it's similar, but it's actually someone who's competing for the same dollar in your customer's wallet. Now, what we typically do is we misidentify our competition. And we say, Burger King is competing with McDonald's, is competing with Wendy's. There's a really interesting bit of research that was done by a professor out of Harvard named Clayton
Hmm.
Christensen, who is kind of my dashboard saint. Like, I love the guy. And in in this research, he showed that actually McDonald's at certain times was not competing with Burger King or Wendy's. It was competing with bananas, donuts, bagels, Snickers bar, smoothies, right? And so, but the military strategist would say, no, your competition is Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's. And so when we do that, we fail to position ourselves appropriately, which is some of the stuff that Sun Tzu talks about. Sun Tzu talks about positioning. He talks about understanding who you are. He talks about understanding your competition. He talks about the terrain. He talks about spies. He talks about what you should and shouldn't respond to. But unless you have that, and I'm going to read from my translation here because it's going to give some really good insight. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
if I can find it. Let's see here.
Well, well, while you're looking for the piece that you're looking for,
Yes.
let me do this. So the way that the way that my translation is divided is it's divided into a number of different parts with the translator's introduction by Thomas Cleary. We covered a lot of that on episode 22, and we talked a little bit about Thomas Cleary, who actually passed away in 2021, just before we launched the podcast. And the way that he has it divided up, he puts it into different parts. So he has strategic assessments, doing battle, planning a siege, formation, adaptations, armed struggle, emptiness and fullness. So he has force. So he has these is divided up into all these
Yeah.
chapter sections with these titles. And in the first chapter section around strategic assessments, which I suspect is probably where Zac is going, again, the way that he divides this up is he names the individuals who give these Twitter-like quotes around military strategy, what
Yeah.
the ancient world's version of tweets, right? Quoting from Master Sun, Li Quan, Dumu, Jialin, Mei Shen. He's pretty much keeping this order throughout the book. So that's the order that he's got the folks listed in. And so right at the beginning, in strategic assessments from Master Sun, he quotes this: military action is important to the nation. It is the ground of death and life, the path of survival and destruction. So it is imperative to examine it.
Yes. And I will build on this because this is actually from the third section. So in my translation, this translator really tried to keep it more tied to its
Mhm.
roots. So he included things like the three armies, terms that are archaic that we wouldn't comprehend. He includes words like Tao, which have very deep cultural meaning. In the Tao Te Ching, which is the scripture of Taoist religious philosophy, the first thing that it says is the Tao that can be written is not the true Tao. And when you boil that down and look at its deeper meaning, what it's saying is Tao is a state of being. It is a state of moral rectitude because you have to
Mm.
synthesize this with Confucianism. The two borrow back and
Mhm.
forth. So it's a state of moral rectitude. So when in my translation, he's talking about the Tao of the general or the Tao of victory, it's this state of being that will create victory.
Interesting. Okay.
And part of what he talked about in section 3, which is planning offensives. Oh, no, section 4, excuse me, which is military disposition. He says, as for military methods, the first is termed measurement, the second, estimation of forces, the third, calculation of numbers of men, the fourth, weighing relative strength, and the fifth, victory. Now, this is the important part. Terrain gives birth to measurement. Measurement produces the estimation of forces. Estimation of forces gives rise to calculating the numbers of men. Calculating the numbers of men gives rise to weighing strength. Weighing strength gives birth to victory. So if we're setting this in a cause and effect sort of thing, the very first thing that you have to get right in order to be victorious is understanding the terrain that you're competing on. And all too often in general business strategy, and circling this back to my point, all too often in general business strategy, we say that our competition is our market or the people who are delivering like services, because that is the terrain that we perceive. The actual competition or competitive space is the wallet of your customer. And because businesses get that wrong, businesses fail all the time.
This is an incredible insight, because you're right. In business strategy, and even I myself have fallen into this trap, right? I mentioned before category errors, right? We make this error, right, of presuming that the position is the terrain, right? Which, by the way, I love the book Positioning. I love that book. Found that book back in the from the 1970s. That was written by a couple of marketers who were seeking to create a brand for 7-Up and couldn't really figure out a way to move the market, such as it were, but really about moving people's perceptions from really thinking about Coca-Cola and Pepsi to thinking about 7-Up, right? And the brilliant sort of idea that they came up with was that there are quadrants in your brain, and each one of these brands occupies a quadrant. And so if you want to successfully launch something else, you need to move into a different quadrant in a person's brain, right? Positioning, right? We now have folks that are floating around on Facebook and other places that are talking about depositioning, which is a whole other idea.
This sounds a lot to me like blue ocean
It is.
strategy.
It comes out of blue ocean strategy. It comes out of a different interpretation. You mentioned Clayton Christensen, a different interpretation of Christensen, and so it comes out of the merging of a bunch of different ideas together. But that's depositioning. But I like the OG. I like positioning, because and to your point about Sun-Tzu, we don't understand the terrain very often that we're on. And by the way, in my translation, I found the exact same thing that you quoted. It's in chapter 4, but it's at the end underneath formation.
Yeah.
And it says the rules of the military are 5: measurement, assessment, calculation, comparison, and victory. The ground gives rise to measurements. Measurements give rise to assessments. Assessments give rise to calculations. Calculations give rise to comparisons. Comparisons give rise to victories. That's a subtle difference. And there is a distinction inside of that difference. And yet the core idea there, speaking of the Tao, the core idea there is still the same. If you don't understand the terrain you're on, or if you're confused about the terrain you're on, then you will not have you won't even be able to set yourself up for victory. And by the way, I see this in my background as a conflict management and negotiation person. Professional. Most people are amateur negotiators for a whole variety of reasons, but the biggest one is they don't understand the ground, the psychological ground they're negotiating on.
Yeah. It's interesting because just a couple paragraphs up above in my translation, it says, for the victorious army first realizes the conditions for victory, then seeks to engage in battle. Yeah. And there's a lot there to understand, like to realize the conditions for victory. It's not just setting goals, right? It's like, no, how do you define your conditions of victory so that you can say we are victorious? And then how do I plan in advance to set up those conditions? How do I make sure that my team actually does those things that I ask them to do that will bring about victory? How do I make sure that we're all on the same page? This is all part of the Tao of being a good leader and the Tao of creating victory, right? This is all part of what has to, and I say it that way because Tao is a state of being. It has to be a part of who you inherently are as a leader in order to actualize that victory. And that's the thing that we often think about or fail to think about, I suppose, because we get so busy going through the motions of these things that we're not actually embodying them.
So the leadership culture that we've had and the business culture, the business strategy culture that we've had over the last 100 years. Let's go back to Henry Ford, right? And that hoary old gentleman of measurement all the way at the bottom, Frederick Winslow Taylor. Let's go back to him, right? Because again, I'm an OG guy, right? I like to go back to root causes. I'm a root cause guy. It does us
Yeah.
no good to it does us no good to try to fix the tree by trimming a few branches. Sometimes you got to go all the way to the root, right? And
Yeah.
at the bottom of all of Henry Ford, no, at the bottom of modern assumptions around leadership, and again, the last 100 years in the West, at the basement of all those assumptions has just been that people don't need to be led. Strategy does not need to be defined as long as the founder is the North Star, which that's
Hmm.
fine. It works just fine. We see this, by the way, in the startup founders that we have now. We were just talking about before we hit record, we were just talking about Mark Zuckerberg, right? I think Facebook will be
Yeah.
fine as long as Mark Zuckerberg continues to roll jujitsu. And he's a blue belt like me. So, hey, continue to roll jujitsu and choke people, and it'll keep you young, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, most
Hey, you're doing jujitsu, I'm doing
so
karate.
there you go,
So
right? Yeah. Continue to
yeah.
roll, continue to do all that. You'll stay young forever. But at a certain timeline, on a long enough timeline, everybody's survival rate, to paraphrase from the movie Fight Club, drops to zero, right? So what do you do when the founder's gone? We see this with Apple computers. I always bring up Apple computers,
Oh yeah.
right? So,
Well, Microsoft.
right, or Microsoft, right? Like Bill Gates isn't gone, but he might as well be for all intents and purposes with that company. So the assumptions that the founder is the North Star and that somehow the founder is going to just via osmosis give this strategy to his followers is a dangerous strategy that we have all bet on in business.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't see this is just a comment. I don't see a way out of it. I don't see us backing away from that anytime soon.
Well, and I think you're right because we as America, going back to root causes, 1890s up to the 1920s, America changed culturally. We changed from a culture of character, and you can look at this in the materials, the books and the things that were popularized from the pop culture up to like the 1890s, it talked about character. So you would talk about the pyramid of character. That man is a man of character. 1920s come around, 1890s to 1920s come around, and it changes. It changes from character to personality. And we become a culture that's driven by personality. And I would even argue that after the advent of social media, we enter into a culture of hyper personality, where you take the personality and you ramp it up to
Mm-hmm.
100, right? This isn't Spinal Tap, this one goes to 11. We're going to 100. And the problem with that, I'm glad you like that. The problem with that is that it creates it don't think deeply about anything. All they have to do is be hyper personalities in order to gain fame. And this is all social media influencers do. They take their personality, ratchet it up, and then they focus on one thing. I'm the book person, I'm the makeup person, I'm the movie person. And that's all they are. And culture loses its complexity. And so we're putting these personalities on a pedestal, and we're trained to do that culturally. And the only thing that's going to change that is the culture. And the problem with that is that you were highlighting, and I think correctly, the problem with that is that it doesn't create longevity because you have a company like Apple that is one of the largest companies in the world in the history of the world, right? Like it is uh, larger than the economy of the nation of Poland, to give some perspective. Like it's massive. And Steve Jobs
Hmm.
dies, and they try and put in Tim Cook,
Hmm.
right? Tim
Yeah.
Cook's at Apple.
Yep.
I always think they try and put in Tim Cook. Tim Cook is supposed to be Steve Jobs' protege, and the last real unique thing that Apple put out was innovated by Steve Jobs.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're just moving buttons around on the iPhone.
Absolutely. There is no real innovation. The thing that I saw that was like, oh, this is a Steve Jobs level innovation was the digital AI assistant pin. Have
I've
you
seen
seen
these.
these?
Yeah. Hmm. Yep.
That was the last thing that I saw that was even close to a Steve Jobs level innovation. And it came from a former Apple engineer. It didn't even come from their own ecosystem
So
because we're built around these this cult of personality when we should be built around a cult of customer.
So it's interesting that you bring up character. Two things, two data points. One, um, I just saw on LinkedIn that former 4-star general and White House chief of staff member Stanley McChrystal is out there promoting a book talking about character. And I didn't read the whole post on LinkedIn. I didn't really need to because, and here's why I didn't need to. Um, when we talk in military terms about character and ethics and integrity, there's something that undergirds that conversation about character that doesn't exist currently in our larger culture, which is why we've replaced it with a cult of personality. And the thing that undergirds that conversation in the military is a concept of tradition and ritual. And we
Yeah.
unfortunately live in a time, I was just ranting to somebody about this the other day. But we unfortunately live in a time when we struggle as a national body to hold on to national rituals, national traditions. So about the only shared national tradition we have, about the only shared one we have is July 4th. And even that's getting chipped at the edges, right? Um,
Yes.
because if you can remove that, if you could pull the tradition out, right, then you can do all kinds of other things with the edifice. You can shape it and mold it
Yes.
and turn it, right? And so it's interesting you brought up the 1890s to the 1920s because we just read before this episode, we just read Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I'm a big fan
Mhm.
of the books that come out of that post World War One and even pre World War One sort of European American zeitgeist, right? Because I do
Yeah.
think fundamentally we still don't understand exactly what World War One did to us as a set of nation states around the globe. We still haven't fully wrapped our arms around that war, or the consequences of it. That's number one. Number two, the lost generation, which mirrors, quite frankly, the nomad generation, of which I'm the youngest end
Yes.
of that generation. I feel a lot of affinity for because they saw the edifice fall down and they had, particularly in Tender is the Night, but you see it even previous to World War One in Parade's End by Ford Maddox Ford, and then later on in Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway, and of course A Farewell to Arms, John Dos Passos's USA trilogy, all of which we cover here on the podcast. You should go listen to all those episodes. It's like a feast for the ears. It's like 8 hours of listening, but we're trying to find the answers to why the edifice fell down. And the edifice didn't just fall down in men and material, it fell down to your point about character.
I think you're right. I think that as a society, particularly as Western civilization, we're still processing I mean, you look at it, and when you talk about a lost generation, it literally was a lost generation. And then when you compare that with Russia, I mean, Russia after World War II, it lost like one out of every three men. Like it was a complete shift in demographics that they have not recovered from. And arguably, the Ukraine war is partially a result of that. And so we're looking at this complete collapse of society's, not a collapse, but yeah, a collapse in trust in society's institutions because in World War One, we had the ultimate faith in society's institutions, particularly as Western nations, and those institutions led to the slaughter of millions of young men. And so society is like processing, I trusted you, government. I trusted you, king. I trusted you, emperor, and you let me down. And so it creates this modernist interpretation of the world, which then leads to postmodernism, which is sort of the children of modernists trying to make sense of what happened to mommy and daddy as a result of World War
Hmm.
One. And it's created this, in my opinion, negative downward spiral of complete lack of faith in any institution. So you often see, and this is just anecdotal, and I'd love your insight on this, but I think that you often see nihilism and postmodernism go hand in hand because postmodernism gives birth to
Oh
nihilism.
yeah. Well, I mean, you could even assert, and we've covered oh gosh. Well, I mean, we've covered books from the communist writer Milan Kundera on here, who wrote in the face of who wrote in the face of communism, sort of what do we do now? Um, we've
Yeah.
covered um, we've covered Sartre on this podcast. We've covered Camus, and we're going to cover Camus again this year on the podcast. L'étranger, or the stranger. You know, we're going to talk about that. And even you can even see it in our popular culture. So Robert Heinlein, Philip K. Dick,
Yeah.
Frank Herbert, and we've covered Dune. We covered Dune last year on the podcast, a book that I had never successfully actually read through before. I
Oh,
had to read
great
it for the
book. Great
had to
book.
read it for the show. Great book, actually. I found out well, the first time I encountered Dune, I was 8, and the edition had like 8 point or 10 point type. It was really tiny, and book was really thick.
Ooh.
And I'm 8 years old, and I'm like, this is nonsense. I read like 4 pages. I was like, I'm done. I don't know what they're talking about. I was gone from it.
Yeah.
And that was always my Dune story until last year, and then I finally read it, and I was like, oh, this is actually not horrible. There's some really deep insights in here.
It's it's a libertarian treatise on the dangers of savior
It
complexes.
is. It is. And then you read Orson Scott Card, you read Ender's Game, which is another book we've talked
Yeah.
about, where you kind of go in the opposite direction of that. And so the nihilism and the postmodernism have to walk hand in hand, because if you believe in nothing, but you got to laugh in order to get through it, laughter only works for a certain type of person, interestingly enough, at a certain
Yeah.
type of class level, which is why most nihilists are Marxists, and only works at a certain type of intellectual status level, which is why most postmodernists come out of academia. I've never met yet a blue collar postmodernist. I have met people who operate on postmodern assumptions and happen to do blue collar work and don't understand where those assumptions come from. So, you know,
Yes.
the
100%.
blue collar guy who's driving a tractor or picking up garbage and is on his second divorce and doesn't understand why, he's operating in a society that's driven by postmodernist assumptions around freedom and hedonism and libertinism, and he hasn't examined any of those.
Constructing power structures.
Correct. And he hasn't examined any of those because no one's helped him examine any of those, which is part of the reason why we do this podcast, so we can talk about it. But but he's not a postmodernist. He's not educated enough to be a postmodernist. However, I've run across many folks in academia who will claim to be postmodernists, and here's the rub. They will claim to be postmodernists. They will claim to be in favor of hedonistic licentiousness, and yet they've been married to the same person faithfully for 30 years.
That is interesting. That is utterly fascinating to me.
Something doesn't match. And it's because
I
of the cynicism that's inside of these systems. And when you can be cynical, but your economic status keeps you safe from the results of your cynicism. This is Rob Henderson and luxury ideals, right? You can afford to hold all these luxury ideas that have absolute no consequence on your real life. However, when luxury ideals transpose down through a society, in which institutions are fractured because of a lack of character going back 100 years or going back 80 years, and no one's bothered to explain that to anybody, including, quite frankly, the Christian church, which should have explained that specifically in the
Amen.
West, but I'll leave that aside for just a moment. But even they were captured by these ideas. So, but you go all the way down, and these ideas are not explained. These luxury ideals now have deleterious consequences for people who don't have the status to survive the consequences of these ideals.
Right.
If you're a garbage man, I'm sorry, like you may be making $80 to $120,000 a year to pick up my garbage, but that's not enough security to be on your second marriage and have 4 kids that hate you from 2 different women.
And that's really hard, right? Like, and that's the thing that is why postmodernism, nihilism is so dangerous, but also why it's a reaction to the First World War and that lack of character, right? Because the First World War, we had been lied to. We had been propagandized to believe that our leaders were as morally righteous and upright as we thought we were. And then it exposes that dark, chaotic, hedonistic, licentious underbelly. Like read The Last Lion. It's a 3-volume biography of Winston Churchill that is just amazing. And one of the first things that it talks about is the ideals of Victorian England as opposed to the actualities, particularly for the royals. Like the royals, it was morals for thee, but not for me. Like King Edward had a chair made so that he could have threesomes. Like Winston Churchill's mother was a darling because she was really good in bed and she was sort of like this exotic beauty from across the ocean, and all of these men tried to woo her. Like, and she allowed them to. That's, so you have this sort of understanding that all of a sudden all of that comes out. And now these postmodernists are saying, well, all power structure is inherently stupid and needs to be questioned. And it leads to this lack of, like, to your point, lack of trust in institutions. Institutions make up society. You cannot have a functioning society. You cannot have a functioning business. You cannot have a functioning church. You cannot have a functioning organization if every member, or at least the majority of the members involved in it, question the very fabric of the rules of conduct.
Right.
And that's what we're experiencing right now at a larger level in our culture. And yeah, I mean, it is poison. It is absolute poison. And that garbage truck driver, that, UPS driver, whoever that's making $120,000 a year, they're doing pretty good. They have been lied to by society. And the women who that man was married to, who divorced, have been lied to by society as well. Right? Like there are so many different aspects of this, because third wave feminism is really just a diaspora product of postmodernism.
Oh, hold on to that thought. We're going to go back to the book. Hold on to that thought. Back to the book. Back to at least my translation and Zac's translation of The Art of War.
Tell me section.
Yeah. So I'm going to dive into strategic assessments. There's a section called strategic assessments in my book. I've marked this up quite extensively.
What number?
In my book is marked number 1.
Okay.
But it may be marked differently in your book.
I have the same number of sections as you. The titles are different.
Okay.
But the sections, if you look at the base, they're the same.
Cool.
So go ahead.
Cool. So I'm going to pick up in strategic assessments. I'm going to go through 4 pages in. I'm going to start. We'll figure out the ground you're on. Yeah, I have this right here. So Master Sun, right? Therefore, use these assessments for comparison to find out what the conditions are. That is to say, which political leadership, you talk about the Tao, which political leadership has the way, which general has ability, who has the better climate and terrain, whose discipline is effective, whose troops are stronger, whose system of rewards and punishments is clearer, This is how you can know who will win. One of the points I want to make on that is that, and we sort of have a jog through, as we do usually on this podcast, we start with something very narrow and then we broaden it and then we go back to the narrow thing. It's sort of the flow of what we're doing here. One of the things that Jocko Willink, very famous Jocko Willink, right, says on his podcast, the Jocko podcast all the time, he's become notorious for it, and it's a titular line because it's amazing, actually. Discipline equals freedom.
Yes.
And again, he comes out of a military tradition with strong rituals, strong orientation towards character, ethics, all that, even though things are fraying at the edges there too, but still a strong orientation towards that, right? And being a good leader, being able to not only understand the terrain that you're on, but being able to engage in the discipline of doing things and making assessments that may not necessarily, for lack of a better term, be sexy or be popular, and then committing directly to that strategy, to that forward direction, is the hallmark not only of a good leader, but it's also a hallmark of a leader with character. Now, that doesn't mean that leader isn't flexible. What it means is the reed bends in the wind, but it never breaks, right? Or another way to frame it in a more Western context, I kind of always tell this story from the great Zig Ziglar, the great motivational speaker Zig Ziglar. If Zach and I are on a plane, right, and we have bought a ticket to Denver, let's say we're flying to Denver from, I don't know, St. Louis, right? Let's just pick a random place, right? If I'm going from St. Louis to Denver and it says on my ticket I'm going to Denver, Zach and I get on the plane, pilot, takes off, we're going, and all of a sudden a storm pops up. If the pilot comes on the radio and says, listen, we hit some turbulence and we're turning and going back to St. Louis, Zach and I will riot on the plane. We're not going back to St. Louis. We're going to Denver. Denver is where it says on my ticket that I'm going to be at. I made commitments in Denver. Zach made commitments in Denver. Doesn't matter if we don't share the same commitments. We need to go to Denver. And by the way, the pilot knows this. So what does the pilot do? The pilot doesn't turn around and go back to St. Louis. The pilot just adjusts his flaps. He raises or lowers the plane, and we keep going to the destination. This is the Western way of thinking about the reed bending but not breaking. This is still discipline, though. It requires discipline to be inside of the turbulence of the wind or the turbulence of the turbulence, and be able to maintain discipline when everyone around you and everything around you is, for lack of a better term, and to mix a bunch of metaphors together, which I love doing on my own show, when everything around you is on fire, right? One of the challenges we have today, here's a question. I do have a question embedded in here. One of the challenges we have here today in our time, and you're a native Mandarin speaker, and I want to explore this a little bit here, is we are currently in an era of business turbulence, and tariffs is a symptom of a much larger disease. The larger disease is the breakup of the global order established after World War II. The Bretton Woods Agreement is basically over. But we don't know what comes after that. And so, for lack of a better term, in a multipolar world, we're throwing a bunch of spaghetti at the wall trying to see what sticks. Our biggest spaghetti thrower is Donald Trump, whether you like it or not. That's the biggest spaghetti thrower. But also Xi Jinping is in there. Vladimir Putin is in there. Erdogan in Turkey is in there. MBS in Saudi Arabia is in there. Modi in India is in there. Macron, oh, absolutely. Keir Starmer. By the way, we did a whole geopolitical jog when we were reading Parade's End. You should go listen to that episode where I basically put forth my theory that France will wind up running the EU in the next 20 years.
Oh, that's 100%.
Because I don't see anybody else. I don't see anybody else on that continent that's gonna mount up to be able to control that entire entity.
Well, and Germany has the demographics aren't solid enough. France is the only nation that has solid enough demographics, and the UK is cozying up to the United States. So there's no one in that sphere who is strong enough to stand up to a rising Turkey and a potentially militant
Potential,
Russia.
right? And you talk about the Brits cozying up to the Americans. The Brits can only cozy up to the Americans if the British can figure out what it means to actually be British.
True.
And if they can't figure out how to do that, if they can't figure out what that, if they can't wander back to what that means. One of my buddies believes that there will be a lot of internal strife and potentially even a civil war in England. I don't know that it'll go
Awesome.
that far, but I think they're going to have a very vibrant conversation about what it means to be British for about the next decade, and they're going to have to come to some conclusions about what that actually means. My point is this. My
Yes.
question is this: you're a native Mandarin speaker. You have some insight into by knowing the language, you have some insight into the mind of at least, if not Chinese culture, at least a glimpse more than maybe I've got. Um, what should we be thinking about in the West in terms of strategy in relation to and relative to China in a multipolar world? And you can speak from Sun-Tzu in relation to strategy around this. I think that there's an open door there. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that one of the things that we don't understand because we don't have the same cultural roots, we have to remember that China was separated from Europe for a really long time. And so they have two different cultural upbringings, right? China, Asia, arguably Asia, excluding Japan, has a Han sort of ethnic Han cultural root, the same way that the West has a Greco-Roman cultural root. Um, and so it means that people like Sun-Tzu and Confucius, or Kongzi as they call him, um, and Taoism are to them what Plato's Republic and Stoicism and Periclean democratic thought is to us.
Hmm.
And because we don't understand that root, we enter into this sort of ethnocentrist state of thought. And what I mean by that is that we think that our way is the right way. We're unwilling to acknowledge the things that we don't know that we don't know. We're unwilling to acknowledge, hey, maybe China has some ways that they do it that are better. China isn't that way. China right now is, if you believe the demographics that are coming out and what the analysis on those demographics are, it's could be terminal,
Could be.
right? And yeah, you have to go like this because it's a could be. But China is very much at a place of um inflection, let's say. And so as we move into a multipolar world, there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of that are cultural roots for the Chinese, and for Asia in general. One is face, the concept of face. We don't have that concept here. Um, The closest thing I would say is like honor, right? And when we talk about honor, we kind of go in our minds to like the glove slap and you, sir, have impugned my honor. And like that's not at all what it is. Face is deeply, deeply ingrained in their culture, such that if a young person does not get the right score on a test, they will commit suicide because it's a loss of face for themselves and their
Mhm.
family. And so that's one thing that we don't understand because we go in and we don't have that concept of face. In fact, we don't have the same level of familial um, piety or loyalty that they do. Found family, which you know has its merits, but found family is a constant and massive part of our cultural zeitgeist right now. It is not in Asia. The found family is like, what are you talking about? You can hate your family, but they're still your family, and you're still going to do whatever it takes to help
Mhm.
them. Like that's part of their cultural zeitgeist. And so like that whole concept of face is really important to them. And so when we come in, and I'll just give you an example of contract, business
Mhm.
contracts. So when we come in, our typical thing is that we're going to write up a contract and we're going to say, these are the terms of the contract. I expect you to abide by these contracts. The Chinese culture is really good at finding the liminal space. And so they will do just about anything but what's in the contract sometimes. And so if you go in there and you start telling them, how dare you violate the terms of the contract? I'm going to sue you and blah, blah, blah. That's causing a loss of face for them. And it means that they have to culturally plant in their heels because if they give any ground, it's a further loss of face. So, love him or hate him, Donald Trump's approach to handling the negotiations with North Korea were probably pretty good because he was coming in, he was giving Kim Jong-un face and saying, "Yeah, we're buddies, blah, blah, blah." He doesn't believe that. He's just giving Kim Jong-un face so that he can get what he wants out of him. And that's what we overlook. So
Mhm.
you have to think about this and you have to give them face. You have to think about this strategically in what can I do to preserve their mobility, preserve my mobility. In the Art of War, it talks about, and I don't know if I'll be able to find it. Here it is. Maybe it talks about controlling. Here it is. Thus, and this is section 4, it says, thus, one who excels at warfare first establishes himself in a position where he cannot be defeated while not losing any opportunity to defeat the enemy. So it's about preserving your own mobility and boxing in the enemy. And that's what the Chinese are really good at. And we, like as leaders, we don't think that way because it's not a part of our cultural tradition, but it would be an incredibly beneficial tool to have in our tool belt.
Well, and we can't get there because the thing that would have helped us understand that is the one. And I remember I said I was going to get back to Christianity in a minute. Here we go. Well, here we go. So, to paraphrase from the New Testament from my buddy Paul, from my buddy Paul, a little leaven going to work through the whole loaf, right? Like it's gonna work through, right? And so the 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 Western mind, shorn of Christianity, hears what you just said and goes, "Well, that's just deception. Crush those people." Like that's just the pagan Roman approach to that is, "Oh, you break contract, I kill you. I put an axe in your face,
Yes.
and not only that, I burn down your house, and I burn down like I enslave your children and your wife, and then I salt the ground of your crops."
Yes.
The only reason we don't do that to each other now is because of a guy who died on a cross and rose again 3 days later. And that entire story, which no one has ever denied, has gone out like leaven through the loaf over the course of 2,000 years throughout the entire West. And it is only in the last 200 years, with some success, that we've managed to drain. We talk about postmodernism and nihilism. We've managed to drain some of that leaven out of the loaf and replace it with stuff that is closer to the paganism of the past rather than a perception of Christianity in the future. Okay. So the neo-pagan mind of the 2020s and of the 2030s hears that and goes, oh, those people just aren't trustworthy. That's just deception. The Christian mind hears that and goes, well, okay, so we'll just deal with those folks with an open hand, and they will perceive us as suckers, but that's okay, because Christian charity will convert them. We will convert them by our deeds. We will show our belief by our acts, right? And over the long course of time, over a 2,000-year long stretch, which who knows if we have another 2,000 years, but let's just say we do, over a 2,000-year long stretch, we're going to get those people. And this is why when I hear, and I do hear of Christian missionaries going to China, you do hear about the challenges that they have in that country. You do hear about folks being locked up in gulags and house churches, being the communists try to find house churches, as many as they can, but they can't stomp it out. And here's the interesting thing. They don't know why. They don't know why they can't stomp it out. And I would tell them, but they wouldn't listen. They're not listening anyway.
No,
but I'll just tell the communists, who are basically atheist Confucians, let me tell you why it's not working. It's not working because there's a power called the Holy Spirit, I fundamentally believe, that's working through the prayers of about, and doesn't have to be a billion, this is why I sort of waved my hand a little bit, let's say it's around 850 million people. That's a lot of prayers. Even if it's just 1%, that's a lot. And God, well, I fundamentally believe from a Christian perspective, will answer those prayers regardless of what the state does. And by the way, we have a perfect example of this happening in the 20th century. That was the fall of the Berlin Wall. What crushed the Berlin Wall was a combination of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and here's a third guy that everybody forgets about, the Pope.
JP too.
So, my Protestant brothers and sisters are going to rebel and send me a bunch of nasty gram letters, and that's okay. You can send me a bunch of emails. It's fine. We can have a chat about Billy Graham and how he had to struggle to get on board with the anti-abortion train. And then you can go away and leave me alone. You can just go away and leave me alone after that. We all have our foibles and sins. No one is perfect.
And see, I'm a Latter-day Saint. So I just sit on the sidelines and just eat.
That's okay. Popcorn. You sit there and you eat popcorn. We'll get to you in a minute.
Well, I know my church's history.
So my point is, if you have that dynamic, right? But we're approaching the very secular moment of trade, right, in a multipolar world. I don't know how you can negotiate in a way that saves face without having some sort of, for lack of a better term, transcendent belief system back there that gives you the cultural confidence to negotiate with them with face.
And I would say that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Face is like, it's brown nosing, but it's a lot more subtle than that. It's like, so I'll give you an example. Anytime I go into a Chinese restaurant, and I know how to pick them because the good names are not run by Chinese people and the food is always terrible. If it's like the Lotus Garden at Emperor's Way, all right, this is not going to be good Chinese food. Oh yeah. But if it's something like China Magic Noodle, you're like, all right, that's my jam. This is going to be good. And so, I'll go in. And one of the things that I learned when I was in Taiwan is that one of the best things you can do to give someone face in a very short amount of time is to call them shinku, which means burdened. Oh, you're so shinku. You're working so hard. You're so burdened. You have so much responsibility on your shoulders. You must be very trusted. And there's all of this cultural context that goes in with just calling someone shinku. You're burdened because you are trustworthy, you're responsible, you're working hard. The boss sees what you're doing, and man, he knows that you can really deliver. Like there's all of that wrapped into one
Hmm.
word. And we don't understand that because our language is a semi-phonetic alphabet, right? You know, it's weird, but theirs is a pictograph
Hmm.
system. And their pictographs, I'll give you an example. Their pictographs have deeper
Hmm.
meaning. So the character for man means it has two what they call radicals, which are sub-pictographs. One is a field, and I write on my hand because that's what they do. They'll write the character out on their hand. One is a field, and then they partner it with power. So men have strength in the field. I'll give you another example. The character for good is a radical of a woman and a child.
Because women have strength in
That is good.
childbirth. Yeah. Okay. Or goodness in childbirth.
Or it's
Yeah.
good. Women, it's good for a woman to have a
Right.
child. I'll give you another example. The character for relieve is a cross and three radicals for power.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
So their language is 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years old and bears the cultural weight of 8,000 years of societal teaching. And they see it every day.
So fundamentally, then, and we'll get back to the book here in a minute because I'm working on an
Sure.
idea here. No, this is good because these are things that normally we don't talk about on the show. Normally we don't have a guest that's versed
No,
in
we
this
don't.
that's versed in this space and can at least introduce some of these ideas to our listeners. So, um, how would okay? Let me frame it this way. So, thinking about what you do at Ignition Point Strategies, right? Thinking about those high intent sales, right? How would that model? This is something that's interesting to me in a
Sure.
multipolar world, right? How would that model or would that model translate into a Han cultural context? How would that, or is there a one-to-one translation, or is it just not possible because too many of the assumptions that
Yeah.
exist underneath like your actual core of the business are still too Western? How would that work?
So I would say that it does translate because the thing that we do is we focus on human nature and we focus on causal
Okay.
mechanisms. So what we're looking at is um, we're looking at where do like does your process cause things to stall? Does your people cause things to stall? Is there a lack of understanding? Like there's a whole thing that we do to really get to the root of where are your high intent sales prospects walking
Right.
away. And I'll give you an example. I was reviewing a phone call, a sales phone call the other day, and this person brings up something that was really important to them, that they had achieved preferred status from a business partner. And they didn't bring it up once, they brought it up twice, and the salesperson missed it. It was obviously important to the prospect because they brought it up
Mm-hmm.
twice. And so when that is called out now, you can say, okay, why does that matter to the client or to the prospect? How are we failing to give them those same outcomes that preferred status gives them? How can we give them those same outcomes?
Mm-hmm.
And so it strengthens your position in the market because we're focused on outcomes. We're not focused on product features and benefits. We're not focused on specific objections or anything like that. We're just coming in with a completely agnostic perspective and saying, what is this person trying to create? So when they go to China Magic Noodle, what is the experience they're trying to create? When they hire geez, send, shoot, what is it? I don't know. We'll make up a company.
Sure.
Syntax. When they hire Syntax, why are they hiring Syntax? What is the overall outcome that they're trying to create? And that outcome has social, emotional, and functional implications. And often we focus on the functional and overlook the social and emotional implications. So if I have preferred status with a business partner, that is not a functional thing other than, yeah, maybe it allows me to do this thing better or faster or get easier access. But there's also the social and emotional implications that with something like that bear a lot more weight. And so we're coming in and we're helping these sales teams realize those tiny, subtle, underlooked things that are actually major stall points for their sales.
Right.
And that, the clients think, oh, this is going to be there. Then they get involved in the product and they experience the service and it doesn't align. And so they churn
Right.
out. We clarify and highlight those so that firms can then act on that.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And I could see how that would translate because again, these are things that are going to be, to your point about human nature, term we often use on the show is universal, right? These are things that are going to be universal across all times and climes. Something you brought up that reminded me of something in the book around emptiness and fullness. I want to go to the chapter on that for just a second here.
Yeah. Yeah, my translation, it's vacuity and
Ooh,
substance.
there we go. I kind of like that better. Vacuity and substance. So a couple of different ideas in here. And it goes directly to the tie-in of face, finding the liminal space, absence and presence, which is something that, unless you've really taken an art class in America, which is why the decline of art education is a real tragedy, you're not sensitive to.
Yeah.
We over-index for the verbal in our society, which is fine as a person who makes their living saying stuff that works for me. But we under-index on things like body language, tone of voice, pacing,
Yes.
vocal intonation, and of course the magic of, well, that right there. The magic of the pause, the magic of silence. And so there's a couple different ideas in here that I think relate to what you're talking about, particularly in that absence and presence space. And I relate to this as a jiu-jitsu and a martial arts, practitioner, but it does apply as well to business. I'm going to read a couple of different things from here. From Master Sun: appear where they cannot go, head for where they least expect you. To travel hundreds of miles without fatigue, go over land where there are no people. Interesting. Here's another one: to unfailingly take what you attack where there is no defense. For unfailingly secure defense, defend where there is no attack. So in the case of those who are skilled in attack, their opponents do not know where to defend. In the case of those skilled in defense, their opponents do not know where to attack. Or here's another one. People are familiar with this if they're familiar with Bruce Lee. Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby, you could be the director of the opponent's fate. Or here's another one: to advance irresistibly, push through their gaps. To retreat elusively, outspeed them. And finally, therefore, when you want to do battle, even if the opponent is deeply entrenched in a defensive position, he will be unable to avoid fighting if you attack, where he will surely go to the rescue. Drawing people out. Yeah, the feint, the slip, drawing people out. In my jiu-jitsu game, I'm a big fan of setting traps and doing one thing in one area, or over indexing in one area and then going and doing something else in another area. I'm also a big fan of the game of chess. I taught my kids how to play chess, all my children, and all of them except for the youngest one are at a stage where they can beat me now, which is good. Actually, it's really good. Awesome. And how I tend to play the game of chess is I use traps, I use pincher moves, I use subtle attacks, I hide behind things. I don't, I tend not to telegraph my movement as much as maybe, someone who's less experienced might. But I also have a good holistic sense of, to a point earlier about terrain, a good sense of what I can do with the terrain. Like I've been experimenting recently with, if anybody knows how the chess pieces move, I've been experiencing recently with how the knight moves and how you can put an opponent in check, because increasingly I'm noticing this, people can't do geography in their own, or not geography, or geometry in their own head. They can't draw a shape of an L. They can't reverse that. They can't flip that around. They can't turn it around. And so if you could do that a couple of times in a game, boom, you can go where they're not, or you can set up a feint and use it to do something else, and now you can go in a different direction. So thoughts on that, though? Formlessness and absence and presence.
I think that what Sun-Tzu is highlighting here is what I talked about with the contract earlier. In my translation, he says, thus, when someone excels in attacking, the enemy does not know where to mount his defense. When someone excels at defense, the enemy does not know where to attack. Subtle, subtle, it approaches the formless. Spiritual, spiritual, it attains the soundless. Thus, he can be the enemy's master of fate. To effect an unhampered advance, strike their vacuities. To effect a retreat that cannot be overtaken, employ unmatchable speed. Thus, if I want to engage in combat, even though the enemy has high ramparts and deep moats, he cannot avoid doing battle because I attack objectives he must rescue. So to me, remember how I said that they will do just about anything that's not in the contract?
Yeah, the liminal space.
Like the liminal space, that's what he's talking about there. And they have, you know, I forget how old this work is, but they have literally thousands of years of being trained to look for the liminal space. We don't. We see what's there. We don't see what's not there.
Right.
We are trained from childhood. Look at this picture. Compare these two pictures. What's here that should not be here?
Right.
We're never asked, what's not here that should be here? And that's a huge cultural difference. But as a leader, if you can master both of those skills, all of a sudden you become very valuable, because what's not in my sales messaging that should be here? What's in my sales messaging that shouldn't be here? What's in my competitive set that should not be here? And what isn't here that should? I call it mastering the art of the unknown unknowns. And this is something that I get from Werner Erhard, who talks about you don't know what you don't know. That's exactly what this is in a macro context. The Chinese are trained to look for what is not here that should be here. What don't I know that I don't know? And we're trained for what do I know that I know? And so it creates a difference. But if you can learn and train to look for that liminal space, there is literally an infinite number of moves that you could take in that liminal space. That's why we were so shocked when China went out and they started dredging up islands for remote air bases in the middle of the South Pacific. And why we were so surprised when they went out and started doing the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa and South America. Because they were looking and they were saying, what's not here that should be here? Well, there's harbors that should be here that aren't here. There are trains that should be here that aren't here. Well, let's go give these countries, these developing countries, money with earmarks so that they will do what we want them to do.
Well, and I looked at all that. I got to admit, I looked at all of that sort of behavior over the last now 25 years from China, and I got to admit, I'm one of the rare people who sort of went, oh, okay, well, I guess they've decided to behave like old school colonialists. I guess they've picked up that lesson, because they're doing exactly what the British would have done between the 15th century and the 17th century, across every landmass they could land a ship on. They've done what
they're also doing the opium wars against us.
Correct. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, with fentanyl this time. Oh yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. And so some of this is, and it's interesting. So we talk about, and we even have fallen into this sort of paradigm in this conversation here. We sort of fall into an East versus West kind of dynamic, and the real, for lack of a better term, the real insight is it's not East versus West, to your point. It's East and West, right? We both need each other, right? As you've been talking, I've been thinking repeatedly about the yin and yang symbol, right? Which is a visual representation of this sort of idea, but also Thinking about the nature of, and you talk about human nature, the nature of how human nature molds itself to certain perceptions of power and status, right? When you're high enough up in a hierarchy, right? And so I do think part of the creation of the multipolar world that we are getting into, I think that's going to be happening over the next, I would say conservatively, the next 60 years, is well, at least at least another 4 generational cycle. We have to go through another 4 turnings on this, I think, is going to be a state of the elites, and this is the people who are most impacted by this. News at 11, the elites who have made all of their bones and their status and their billions based on certain rules in a certain order just working are the ones most upset right now because they cannot successfully figure out how to strategize for a future they don't understand. And they never expected, interestingly enough, I don't think they ever expected this to happen to them.
I think you're right. And you can look at the things that are sort of the hangouts of the elite, like
Davos.
Davos and things like
Yeah.
what you can see is that, and I don't really like the term elites because they're like, to me, elite is like that's the term they set for
Sure.
themselves. I have a different context on elite, but let's call them that, right? So the elites, and I know it's semantics, but the elite, um, they're over at Davos and they recognize exactly what you talked about. And so what are they doing? They are actively working to shape the
Right.
future through things like ESG, DEI, um, uh, what is it? CBDC,
Mm-hmm.
central banking digital
Mm-hmm.
currencies, things like that. They're actively working to preserve it. And the thing that threw the huge wedge into the wrench into the machine here, people think it was COVID. It wasn't COVID. COVID was right on track, I think, with what they had planned for it. I don't think it was a deliberate release like other people do, but they had planned for it, the
Mm-hmm.
eventuality of a
Sure.
pandemic. And the thing that stands out to me is that um, generative AI is the one that has thrown the biggest wrench into everything that they are doing. Because if you notice now, 10 years ago, nuclear energy was the worst thing possible. Now that generative AI has come on board and these elites recognize what they can use it for, they can use it to control people's thoughts, they can use it to make more money, they can use it to preserve their status and their livelihoods and their way of living while keeping everybody else down. And that's obviously conspiratorial talk, but they can at least preserve their lifestyles.
Oh, I don't think it's
All of
conspiratorial talk. I think they don't have any better ideas than a neo-feudalism. I don't think they have any better ideas than that. They're not
oh,
geniuses. Like
absolutely.
we attach elite to this idea of maybe intellectualism. No, 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 no. They're not. I've said this before on the show. I will say this again. They are not smart. They're D-level students who graduated from Harvard. A D-level student from Harvard is the same as a land grant student who's a B-level student. It's just they had
Yeah,
enough money to provide a cushion to cover up the fact that they're not that bright.
right.
That's all. That's all. They're really not that bright. And so what a not bright person can only really ever do or repeat in new ways old things that haven't worked. They can't actually innovate to the future. Neo-feudalism or feudalism with AI or feudalism with ESG or feudalism with DEI is still at the bottom feudalism.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I agree with that. And my point is that if you look at it, their plan all of a sudden shifted because of generative AI. They were winding down electricity consumption in the United
Hmm.
States. They were telling people, get ready for rolling brownouts because renewable energy is where we have to go because climate change is the problem. They knew the whole time that nuclear energy was a viable option, that it's the cleanest, safest form of energy we have created to date, but they decided to ignore it because they couldn't monetize it as well as they could monetize other things. But now that AI has come out, look at what's happened. France and Germany, all of a sudden, oh, we're renuclearizing.
Yeah.
China is building thorium-based nuclear power
Yeah.
plants. The United States, we've got to cut bureaucratic red tape so that we can input nuclear energy so that we can meet the growing energy demands of generative AI. That's that's what's coming. And that's the biggest thing that threw the wrench into the plans. And they were not agile
Right.
about it.
Right.
So now they're having to scramble. And that's one of the things that he talks about. You know, he talks about be subtle so that it approaches like it's formless, be spiritual so that it's soundless. He's not talking about like be very quiet and subtle. What he's talking about is understand the subtleties of the movements that you have to make and don't draw attention to
Hmm.
them. It's like what Napoleon says, don't interrupt your enemy when they're making a
Correct.
mistake.
That's right. So we've talked a little while here, and I want to thank you for coming on the show today. This has been amazing. We found out more about not only about your work at Ignition Point Strategies, but also just how how we integrate. And so I want to close out our show because we are winding around towards the end here. I want to take, maybe we could do it in 2 minutes, maybe three, and talk a little bit about, because we were talking before we even hit the record button. Talk about generative AI. So I guess my 30-second rant is this: I'm not worried about generative AI like stealing my mind or starting World War III. I'm really not worried about that. I'm worried about human beings engaged in that process and human beings starting World War III because of human foibles and human failings. But I'm not worried about an algorithm convincing people to, no, I'm not worried
Yeah.
about that. I am fascinated in that prompt thinking. Let's leave it. Let's put it this way: prompt thinking is different than search thinking. So search thinking is based
Yes.
off of the idea that I have to go out and seek something, bring it in, and whatever I bring in, then I have to somehow make work for me. Prompt thinking is based in the idea that I don't have to seek. I instead have to curate what is already there, and from that curation, edit, put things together, build, and then boom, I have this new thing. So we have prompt thinking and we have search thinking. Most people for the last 20 years in small, medium, large size businesses, corporations, organizations, all the way up to our institutions, have engaged vociferously, and because it works, in search-based thinking. That's what Google brought us. AI systems and all the large language models are now bringing this prompt-based thinking, and this is causing a lot of consternation among many people. If you were advising a 22-year-old college graduate, what would you tell them to do? What would you tell them to look at or pursue? And even better, this is get to the book conference, gets the book piece too. What books would you tell them to read to be able to
Okay.
influence their thinking around this prompt-based sort of mindset that is probably going to dominate for the next 20 years?
Yeah, you know, I think the first thing that I would tell them is get grounded in your humanity. Get grounded in your humanity because that is the one thing that AI can never duplicate. They claim that they've been able to create AI that passes the Turing test, which means that it's indistinguishable from a human, but I don't believe that. There, you can always sense that something's off, even with AI generated images at this point. You can always sense it's the saturation in the color is wrong or something like that. Like we just don't have the words to put to it. So I would say get deeply grounded in your humanity because to me, that is the thing that is going to separate you and make you incredibly valuable in the church. So I would, to that point, I would recommend reading things like A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Deeply grounds in humanity. What does it mean to love? Les Miserables is another example of that. What does it mean to love? To love another person is to see the face of God. Like, oh man. Another one, The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis points out he wasn't trying to make an accurate exegesis of heaven and hell. What C.S. Lewis was trying to do was show us how we create heaven and hell right
Mm-hmm.
now, and how we are choosing to isolate ourselves or to move closer to our humanity and our divine potential as sons and daughters of God. Um, I think another one is Alas,
Mm-hmm.
Babylon, which is a 1960s World War III
Mm-hmm.
book. But the reason I love it is it's very much a ensemble piece, and it talks about how humanity and how you working with your neighbors to preserve your humanity will allow you to weather any storm, regardless of how difficult it is. And you have this compare and
Mm-hmm.
contrast. Um, and then just my the last recommendation I would have, and obviously there are business books like Competing Against Luck or The End of Competitive Advantage that just shape my business thinking. But Grant and Sherman, The Friendship That Won the Civil
Mm-hmm.
War, or alternatively, Team of
Mm-hmm.
Rivals. Because what those books show is that great accomplishments are never done in isolation. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go
Mm-hmm.
together. And I think that's what those books highlight, is that people who do business and focus on their humanity and bring in other people who focus on their humanity and who have strengths that make up and complement their weaknesses are the people who will find success in the end. And so that list of books is what I would recommend. Focus on your humanity, your authenticity, and focus on finding other people who do the same thing, and then you can do amazing things. You'll understand how to use tools like generative AI for the best,
Awesome.
but you will firmly grounded in your humanity.
I like that. Stay firmly grounded in your humanity and find other folks who are also firmly grounded in their humanity. Join hands across the aisle and start building your, for lack of a better term, tribe. And the tools will come along and be in their appropriate place as they should be. Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. I want to thank Zac Stucki for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. This was our 150th episode. Great episode, real barn burner. I'd recommend you check out his book list that we're going to have in the show notes. I recommend you pick up those books. And of course, we have episodes featuring C.S. Lewis and Charles Dickens. Not A Tale of Two Cities, but we definitely have covered some of Dickens's books on here, as well as C.S. Lewis. A book that I would add maybe in addition to that list is The Abolition of Man, which
Yes. Oh man.
tells us
Men without chests.
all what the result will be if you keep going down the road that you're going down. And who wants to have that? Once again, I'd like to thank Zac for coming on the podcast. And with that, well, we're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. and tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.